Richard the Lionheart's legend eclipses time. Imagine a king whose battlefield prowess was so legendary. His very name struck awe, terror, and commanded respect within his own lifetime. King Richard I of England, known as Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart. Ascending the throne in 1189, a tale deserving of its own video, his reign was a saga of chivalry and valor. Yet this warrior king spent barely 6 months in England during his reign of 10 years. His heart lay in the Crusades, where he led Christian knights against the might of Saladin. Richard's story is not just one of battle but also of struggle and survival. A king who pawned his realm for the crusade, who was captured and ransomed, and who died as he lived, sword in hand. Dive into the tale of Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader king, whose lion's roar echoes through history. Jerusalem had been in Christian hands since the end of the First Crusade in 1099. The Muslim commander, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known as Saladin, recaptured the city for Muslim forces in 1187. Jerusalem's capture shocked the Christian world, so much so that Pope Urban III is said to have collapsed and died upon hearing the news. Within a day, the new Pope Gregory VIII was elected, and within 4 days of his consecration, issued the call for the Third Crusade. Europe's mightiest rulers were stirred. The loss of Jerusalem, the holy city, was mourned by everyone. Among those who heeded this call was Richard I of England, a monarch whose martial spirit and fervent piety made him the embodiment of the crusading knight. Richard's decision to join the crusade was fueled by deep religious conviction and a fierce desire for martial glory. He saw the crusade not just as a sacred duty to defend Christendom, but as a stage upon which to cast his legacy. His reputation as a military leader was unparalleled. His courage and tactical acumen were the linchpins upon which the success of the crusade rested. The son of Henry II, Richard had inherited a realm fraught with conflict and rebellion. Yet, the allure of the Holy Land transcended these earthly troubles. He sold offices, lands, and titles, famously quipping that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer, all to fund his pilgrimage of the sword. Raising an army is expensive, and Richard was not supplied and ready to set out until the summer of 1190. Richard's leadership was pivotal. He was one of the 3 key monarchs, alongside Philip II of France and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, a virtual dream team of military power. His presence promised a unifying force, a king who could rally the fractured Christian princes against a formidable and respected adversary. Upon reaching Sicily in 1190, Richard faced his first major challenge. The island was in disarray, and his sister, Queen Joan of Sicily, was a pawn in a dangerous Game of Thrones. Her dowry was withheld, and her status as queen was under threat. Richard acted with characteristic decisiveness, seizing Messina to assert his authority. This bold move not only secured his sister's position and inheritance, but also demonstrates Richard's character, further helping to understand his leadership and ability during the crusade. The conquest of Sicily was just the beginning. As Richard's fleet made its way eastward, a violent storm scattered his ships. The tempest drove several vessels, one carrying his sister and betrothed, another with finances geared for the crusade, onto the shores of Cyprus. The island's ruler, Isaac Komnenos, saw an opportunity. Isaac did not harm the women, but seized the treasure. While initially wary, Isaac agreed to return the treasure and send 500 men with them on the crusade. Richard took this time to marry his fiancée, but when Richard returned to his fort, Isaac broke his oath of hospitality and began ordering Richard to leave the island. This enraged Richard. In other words, Isaac never stood a chance and had made a terrible decision. It only took a matter of days for Richard to conquer the whole island, and his victory was so thorough he actually captured Isaac himself. The island would be passed over to the Knights Hospitaller, one of the crusading military orders, with Isaac as a prisoner. The successful campaigns in Sicily and Cyprus were critical to the Third Crusade's progress. With Sicily and Cyprus under his belt, Richard was now poised to make his mark on the Levant. The siege of Acre had been going on for years before Richard arrived. The siege, initially led by Guy of Lusignan, was a daring counterattack against Saladin. Acre, strategically located on the Mediterranean coast, became a lifeline for both sides, allowing supplies and reinforcements to flow continuously. For 2 years, the siege of Acre continued. It was a grueling stalemate until Richard finally arrived. Richard's presence brought a renewed sense of purpose and strategy to the Crusader camp. His military acumen was evident in the reorganization of the Crusader forces and the implementation of innovative siege tactics. Bolstered by Richard's command, they held firm against Saladin's attempts to break the siege, and the dynamics of the siege began to rapidly change. The arrival of additional reinforcements from across Europe, drawn by Richard's charisma and leadership, added to the diversity and strength of the Crusader forces. This influx of fresh troops and resources under Richard's direction was a crucial factor in tipping the balance of the siege. Within a month of arriving, Richard achieved victory, with the city of Acre surrendering. Behind the scenes, things were also interesting. Shortly after Richard's arrival at Acre, he sent a message to Saladin, requesting a face-to-face meeting. Saladin refused the meeting but did say, "It is not seemly for them to make war upon each other." Richard and Saladin never met during the Crusade, although they did exchange gifts as a matter of formality. This may seem odd to us today, but the customs of medieval warfare were different from our own. Saladin tried to negotiate with Richard for the release of the captured Muslim garrison, but Richard had reason to believe that Saladin had delayed far beyond what was reasonable. 2,700 of the Muslim prisoners were cut down in full view of Saladin's army, and Saladin responded by killing all of the Christian prisoners he had captured. As brutal an event as this was, Saladin understood Richard's message, that Richard was not an opponent who could be delayed or defeated easily. Richard was largely responsible for ending a 2-year siege within a month, and was not afraid of issuing hard orders to his men. Richard's men took several other locations in Galilee, and moved on to Arsuf. The march south was a strategic move aimed at securing the coastal cities leading to Jerusalem. Richard knew that controlling these key locations would not only provide a secure supply line, but also serve as a base for future operations towards the ultimate goal of the Crusade, the recapture of Jerusalem. Saladin, adept in guerrilla warfare, aimed to weaken the Crusader army through continuous attacks, hoping to prevent them from reaching and besieging Jerusalem. As Richard's forces advanced, they faced these harassment tactics over and over. Despite these challenges, Richard's martial leadership shone through. He maintained strict discipline among his troops, ensuring they stayed in formation and resisted the temptation to break ranks in response to Saladin's provocations. The culmination of this march was the Battle of Arsuf, a crucial engagement that tested Richard's tactical prowess. Recognizing the right moment, Richard ordered a decisive cavalry charge, turning the tide of the battle in favor of the Crusaders. History tells us that rather than issue orders from the back, Richard was in the heart of the fighting with his men, as the itinerarium describes. There the king, the fierce, the extraordinary king, cut down the Turks in every direction, and none could escape the force of his arm. For wherever he turned, brandishing his sword, he carved a wide path for himself. And as he advanced and gave repeated strokes with his sword, cutting them down like a reaper with his sickle, the rest, warned by the sight of the dying, gave him more ample space, for the corpses of the dead Turks which lay on the face of the earth extended over half a mile. This victory at Arsuf was more than a military success. It was a psychological win that boosted the morale of the Crusader forces and solidified Richard's reputation as a master tactician. The path to Jerusalem was still fraught with difficulties, but first, Richard moved to take Jaffa, which he did, effectively cutting off the coast from Saladin. It had an immediate effect. Saladin no longer seemed as invincible as he once had, and Saladin realized he could not risk open, full warfare with Richard and his army again. Richard understood the complexities of laying siege to Jerusalem, a city with formidable defenses and deep religious significance. He chose to focus on consolidating his gains along the coast, fortifying key positions, and establishing a strong foothold in the region. He remained in Jaffa for a bit to shore up his defenses. In November 1191, Richard resumed leading his army inland towards Jerusalem. On the other side of the war, Saladin, under pressure from his emirs, was forced to significantly reduce his forces, presenting an opportunity for Richard. The crusading army marched practically within eyesight of Jerusalem, about 12 miles away. The city's morale was low, and its capture seemed imminent, but there were problems. Richard felt that in all probability, he could win a siege and capture the city. The problem would be holding the city afterwards. Harsh weather conditions were a problem for the immediate moment, but there were long-term strategic concerns. Richard did not like the idea of being trapped by a Muslim relief force that was undoubtedly on the way, or would be shortly. Saladin might be delayed for the moment, but eventually he could reinforce against Richard far easier than the Crusaders from Europe would be able. It forced a tough decision. Richard ordered a retreat to the coast. Amidst these military maneuvers, political intrigue unfolded. Richard called upon Conrad of Montferrat to join the campaign, but Conrad, wary of Richard's allegiance to King Guy of Lusignan and engaged in his own negotiations with Saladin, refused. The situation escalated in April 1192, when Conrad was elected King of Jerusalem, receiving the support of the local nobility over Guy. Richard, acknowledging the political reality, sold Cyprus to Guy as compensation. However, before Conrad could be crowned, he was assassinated, suspected to be at Richard's behest. During the winter, Richard's forces focused on fortifying Ascalon, a strategic location previously demolished by Saladin. The spring of 1192 saw continued skirmishes and negotiations. In May, the Crusaders captured Darum, a significant victory near Egypt's border. Another attempt to advance on Jerusalem was made in June, bringing the Crusaders within sight of the city. Yet there was internal dissent between Richard and Hugh III, Duke of Burgundy, who led the French forces, over the strategy. Hugh argued for a direct attack on the city to capture it, but Richard was still wary of holding the city. Richard agreed that Jerusalem was the goal, but if they could not hold the city, the crusade would be for nothing. Richard's belief was that Egypt was responsible for most of the supplies of Muslim armies and was the de facto seat of power. Richard argued that they head west to unseat the forces in Egypt, a strategy that would become the basis for virtually all future crusades. As the debate continued, Richard eventually said that he would not lead the army against Jerusalem, but would join an attack only as a simple soldier. Without the consensus of Richard, nor his military mind, the armies again withdrew to the coast. In July of 1192, a turn of events unfolded. Saladin's army, seemingly fueled by anger over the massacre that had happened at Acre, launched a sudden attack and captured Jaffa. The situation spiraled out of Saladin's control, with his own troops acting in fury. Meanwhile, Richard, who had been preparing to return to England, received word of Jaffa's fall. It was too costly a city to lose for future pushes against Jerusalem. Richard personally led a small force of just over 2,000 men in a risky assault from the sea. This caught the Ayyubid forces completely by surprise, as the Crusaders moved to free Saladin's prisoners to bolster Richard's ranks. It worked, turning the tide in their favor, and they recaptured the city. Saladin had rallied by this time, and still commanded a much larger force. He had planned a stealthy pre-dawn attack to recapture Jaffa. However, his lightly armored troops were spotted, and the Crusader crossbowmen inflicted heavy casualties, killing 700 of Saladin's men almost instantly. The battle for Jaffa ended in a decisive failure for Saladin, forcing him to retreat and significantly strengthening the Crusaders' coastal position. But this is finally where the Third Crusade completely stalled. On September 2nd, 1192, Saladin, recognizing the changed circumstances following his defeat at Jaffa, entered into negotiations with Richard. The resulting Treaty of Jaffa was the resultant compromise. It concerned quite a bit of Galilee and other holdings divided up among Crusader states and Muslims. But the goal of the crusade, Jerusalem, would remain under Muslim control. Unarmed Christian pilgrims and traders were granted access to the city and were promised safe passage. The contentious issue of Ascalon, a strategic threat to Saladin's domains in Egypt and Syria, was resolved by agreeing to return the city to Saladin, with its fortifications dismantled. The truce was signed and set to last for 3 years. Richard eventually departed the Holy Land in October 1192, conflicted. His departure was certainly necessary. Richard's brother John was beginning to work with Philip II of France in a plot to take power. Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a crusader herself during the Second Crusade, was practically begging Richard to come back and set his kingdom in order. The goal was Jerusalem, but it was not held, and he vowed to return to finish his work, a vow he would not be able to keep. Richard's journey home was anything but smooth, as he had to pass through the lands of many people he had offended along the way. Bad weather forced his ship to dock at Corfu, in the realm of Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelos, who was furious over Richard's annexation of Cyprus. a land previously controlled by Constantinople. To avoid detection, Richard disguised himself as a Templar and set sail with a small party. Continuing once the weather subsided, his ship eventually wrecked near Aquileia, leading to a risky overland journey through Central Europe. As Richard neared the territory of his brother-in-law, Henry the Lion, his luck ran out. Just before Christmas, Leopold of Austria captured him near Vienna. Leopold had a personal vendetta. He was one of the lords who had brought soldiers to Acre during that siege. After the siege, both Richard and Philip II slighted him by casting down his standard over the city. More recently, however, Richard was suspected of involvement in the murder of Leopold's cousin, Conrad of Montferrat. Imprisoned at Dürnstein Castle under the watch of Hadmar of Quinring, Richard's whereabouts initially remained a mystery to England. While confined, he composed Janus Hans Pris, a song expressing his sense of abandonment, directed at his half-sister Marie and his subjects. Pope Celestine III, deeming the detention of a crusader against public law, excommunicated Duke Leopold, who in response sent Richard into the hands of the Holy Roman Emperor. Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI imprisoned Richard in Trifles Castle. Henry VI, already aggrieved by the Plantagenet's support for Henry the Lion and Richard's recognition of Tancred in Sicily, saw an opportunity. He demanded a colossal ransom for Richard's release, nearly 3 times the annual income of the English crown. Eleanor of Aquitaine spearheaded the effort to gather the ransom. The English clergy and laity were heavily taxed, church treasures were seized, and no expense was spared. Meanwhile, Richard's brother John and King Philip of France plotted to prolong Richard's imprisonment, offering Henry VI a substantial sum to keep Richard captive until Michaelmas 1194. Henry VI, however, refused the offer. Finally, after the massive financial undertaking, the ransom was assembled and transported to Germany, with the stipulation that any loss during transit would be Richard's burden. On February 4, 1194, Richard was released, prompting Philip of France to ominously warn John, "Look to yourself, the devil is loose." In Richard's absence, the political landscape of England and its territories underwent a dramatic shift. His brother John had rebelled with the support of King Philip of France. John was not his brother in leadership or war, and Philip had used the opportunity to conquer significant portions of Normandy. Upon his return, Richard faced the betrayal of his brother. Yet, in a surprising move, he chose forgiveness over retribution. John likely realized he could not win against his brother, and Richard was more concerned with Philip of France. When the brothers reunited, Richard not only pardoned John, but also named him as his heir, bypassing their nephew Arthur. This decision underscored Richard's focus on stabilizing his reign and securing the future of his dynasty. To further solidify his authority and erase the dishonor of his captivity, Richard underwent a second coronation. On March 11, 1194, in a grand ceremony at Winchester, Richard was crowned once again. This act was not just a reaffirmation of his kingship, it was a symbolic cleansing of the stain his imprisonment had left on his reputation as a monarch. This second coronation served as a powerful statement to his subjects and rivals alike. Richard the Lionheart was back, not just in body, but in full royal authority. Richard was largely successful in his subsequent war to reclaim his holdings, but as this is a video on his life as a crusader, I will not elaborate. A whole video could be done on that war on its own, so subscribe if you would like to hear that. But I do not feel as if I can stop this story without telling you about why Richard never returned to the Holy Land. Fate had a cruel twist in store for him. On March 26, 1199, as Richard besieged Chalais-Chabrol, a crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder. What at first seemed a minor wound soon festered with infection. When it became apparent that he might not recover, Richard demanded to see the crossbowman, who turned out to be a boy. The boy, seeking vengeance for his slain family, had intended to assassinate Richard. Expecting death, he instead received Richard's mercy and a gift of 100 shillings as the king ordered his release. Richard's magnanimity, however, was overshadowed by tragedy. He succumbed to his wound on April 6, 1199, dying in his mother's arms. His death was later poetically described as "the lion by the ant was slain." In a grim postscript, and one I'm sure Richard would have raged over, Richard's loyal captain Mercadier reportedly flayed and hanged the boy after the king's death. Richard's body was divided in death as in life. His heart was interred in Rouen, his entrails in Chalus, and his body laid to rest at Fontevraud Abbey, beside his father. Centuries later, analysis of his embalmed heart revealed traces of frankincense, symbolically linking Richard to Christ. Visions and legends followed Richard beyond the grave. Bishop Henry Sanford claimed to have seen Richard ascending to heaven, though only after a purported 33 years in purgatory. Richard left no legitimate heirs, only an illegitimate son, Philip of Cognac. His brother John succeeded him, but Richard's French territories, save for Rouen, initially rejected John, favouring his nephew Arthur. His life may have brought order to his realms, but his death seemed to cause chaos. I'm leaving a few links in the description to some books about the Third Crusade and to King Richard, so please consider learning more. I have been rather brief, and there's a lot more to learn. Cheers.